Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. One very interesting topic that is explored in St. Anselm's Proslogion that often doesn't get the attention that it deserves is this discussion that begins in chapter 13. It has to do with the way God is by comparison to other things. So it's kind of a commonplace that God has no limitations. We talk about God as being omnipotent. That's a lack of limitation on divine power. But we can also think of God in terms of what we can call spatiality or space and time itself. And so the Christian is going to affirm that God is unbounded or unlimited. Incircumstrcriptus is the term that's used there. So not circumscribed to a particular time or place. And God is also eternal. So that's not a controversial doctrine, at least among Christians, but it raises a puzzle. How God is unbounded, this is the title, and eternal, although other spirits are also unbounded and eternal. Does that mean that they're like God? Does that mean that there's a whole bunch of gods out there? Or is there something special about the ways in which God is unbounded and eternal? So Anselm is going to ask this question. He says, everything that is at all enclosed in a place or time, and enclosed is cloudy to closed up within in space and time, is less than, minus, what is not similarly subjected to, as he calls it, the law, the lex of place or time. And we already know that God is that than which nothing greater can be thought. So God is, the greater than anything else. Nothing can be greater than God. So God is not going to be less than anything else. So God won't be confined to any sort of place or time, which doesn't mean, as we're going to see later on, that God isn't in every place and time, but God isn't confined to any place or time. So, this tells us something about God, but then that raises a problem for us. This seems like it can only be said about God, right? So if that's the case, then how is it that other spirits can be said to be unbounded and eternal? How does this actually work? And Anselm is going to come up with an explanation here. So he's going to say, here's a possibility. Is it that a created spirit, so a spirit that is not God, but created by God, is in a certain way bounded, but in a certain way not bounded? Bounded compared to, collatus in Latin, to God, but not by comparison to other things, for example, to bodies. So Anselm is presuming there's a difference between spirit and body here, and he says that surely something is completely bounded when it is wholly in one place. It cannot be in another place at the same time. And that seems, again, pretty straightforward, not too difficult to wrap our heads around. We've got books, for example. They can't both be in the same place at the same time. If this book is over here, then it can't also be over here at the same time. I just moved it, and it's a different time in doing so, right? So even the pages, they can't all be, strictly speaking, in the same place. One page comes after another. And we say this sequentially. What we really mean is spatially, not temporally, although we turn the pages in time. So bodies work like that, right? They are completely bounded, but spirits aren't that way. And Anselm is going to use as an example of this the fact that the soul or the spirit is present as a whole in each part of the body. So it's present in more than one place. The soul is just as present in my eyeball as it is in my chin, as it is in my kneecap. We can go on and on and on. We don't have to enumerate all the bodily parts, right? So spirits are bounded and unbounded at the same time. This is going to be part of the solution to the puzzle. They can be in multiple places, but they cannot be everywhere. So they can't, the spirit that is within my body as a soul can be all over the place in my body, but it can't be over there in your body or somewhere else, say inside of this book, or who knows where else we want to place it. It's confined to a certain space. So it is bounded and unbounded at the same time, according to Anselm. God isn't like that. God is uniquely, singulariter, unbounded and eternal. And you notice that in this chapter, Anselm, in talking about God, has not really explained the eternity part that much. He's focused on the being bounded part. He's just sort of taken it for granted, perhaps, that we understand that God is eternal. But is there an explanation for how God is eternal in a way going beyond that of other spirits who are also potentially eternal? So this is where we need to look at chapters 19 and 20. And Anselm, the beginning of chapter 19, the title is God is not in a place or time, but all things are in him. And he says, if by your eternity you have been and are and will be, and if to have been is not the same as to be in the future, and to be is not the same as to have been or be in the future, how does your eternity exist as a whole always? So this is, again, where we're going to see a big difference. And he has a question. Is it that nothing of your eternity is in the past in such a way that it no longer exists? And nothing is in the future as if it did not exist already? So this is, proposing a solution to this problem about what God's eternity is like. And he says, it's not the case yesterday you were and tomorrow you will be. Rather, you exist in the past, present, and future all at the same time. You have being there. And then Anselm says, well, that's not quite right. Because what that would mean is that, and here we see a limitation coming up, God would be in these different times, whether it's, the generic past, future, present, or whether it's yesterday, today, and tomorrow. And God would be entirely in those times, but God would be, in a certain sense, contained in or confined to those times. It works the other way around for Anselm. Those times are actually going to be in, you could say, in God, which is what he will say a little bit later on, about time itself, or you could say they're in eternity. And this is a very difficult thing to wrap our heads around. What does eternity actually look like? There isn't just one conception of what people call eternity out there. Anselm is proposing one where, think of eternity as sort of like containing all of the times and being present at every one of the times. And at the same time also, as he's going to say of God, being simply outside of time altogether, or of times, plural. So simpliciter, simply, as you are, extra omne tempus. Now, extra omne tempus, so the extra outside of, or beyond, omne tempus could be understood as any time in sort of a generic sense. It could be understood as being outside of every single time, right? So it's a very rich term that he's using there, trying to suggest something to us. And he says, yesterday, today, and tomorrow are merely in time, but you, God, don't exist in a place or time. Rather, all things exist in you. Nothing contains you, but you contain all things. So that is a way of saying how it is that other things could be eternal, but they're not eternal in the same way that God is. And this is going to get explained a bit more in chapter 20, where he's going to ask, how is God before, ante, and beyond, ultra, all eternal things? And he's going to provide us with more of an explanation for the ultra, the beyond, than he is going to the before. And why doesn't he tell us much about the before? In part because he doesn't have to. He's already said that God has created everything out of nothing, right? So God literally is before time itself and before any of the eternal things that have been created by God, which could include, human souls, for example. So how then can God be understood as beyond the eternity of other things? So he says, is it because they can in no way exist without you? Whereas you do not exist any less, even if they return to nothingness? In this sense, or in this way, you are in a certain sense beyond them. So there's one answer right there. God, will exist, does exist at all times, before all times, whereas other things, they can return to nothingness. So that's one way. They can also be thought to have an end. So even though they are, possibly eternal, if God wanted to bring them to an end, God could do so. And then he says, and do you not also surpass even all eternal things? Now here's where we get very metaphysical. In that both your and their eternity is wholly present to you, whereas they do not yet possess the part of eternity that is yet to come, just as they no longer possess the part that is past. In this way, you're indeed always beyond them, because you're always where they haven't yet arrived. So eternity for God is different, is greater than it is for things that we call eternal, that were created by God. So again, we could say by analogy, sort of like how Anselm is going to say spirits are both bounded and unbounded. Eternal things, other than God, are both eternal and also not eternal, right? Not by comparison to God. So this allows us, by comparison of the creator to the created, to understand how it is that some things could seem to have the same attribute, limitlessness or eternity, as God, without actually having it in the same way that God has it, or, in the case of eternity, being it.